With so many new and exciting things happening in Yu-Gi-Oh!, now has never been a better time for new players to come and enjoy this game. And I will be going over the most important parts of the game that you need to know as a new player so you can have a fighting chance. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's go over some of the basics. So in Yu-Gi-Oh!, in order to decide who goes first, we just do a simple roll of the die, and whoever gets the higher roll gets to choose if they want to go first or second. Now, when the game begins, each player draws 5 cards from their deck, and each deck has a limit of 60 cards, okay, with an extra deck limit of 15 cards. Now, the minimum for your main deck is 40 cards, so you can jump between 40 and 60 cards, whatever your preference is, depending on the strategy that you're playing. And the same goes with the extra deck. It has a 15 card limit, but you can play as many cards in the extra deck as you want. But with the extra deck, you can actually play no extra deck if you like. And those are just the simple rules. Jumping straight into the game itself, there are multiple phases that you need to be aware of. First off, we have the draw phase. Literally, as the name implies, where you draw 1 card from your main deck and you start your turn. However, for the person going first, this phase is actually skipped. And then this leads to the standby phase, which is the middle ground between the draw phase and the main phase 1. And in this is just what we call an open game state, where any open quick effects can be activated during that turn, any quick play spells, and any other effects that can be activated in the hand, of which I will go over later. From the standby phase, we jump straight into the main phase 1, which is where the big things happen. In main phase 1, this is where all your effects and summoning happen. To start, each player is allowed what is called a normal summon. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, monster cards have levels, and this is indicated by the stars underneath their name. And a monster with a level of 1 through 4 is allowed to be normal summoned onto the field into any one of the 5 monster zones. You may normal summon them face up in attack position, or you may normal summon them face down in defense position. This is completely up to you depending on your strategy, but a big thing to note is that if you summon any monster in face down defense position, that monster cannot be used for the different summoning mechanics in the game, of which I will go over in more depth later. So as I was saying about normal summoning, monsters have a max level of 12. So with the monster having a level with 5 or 6, they require what is called a tribute in order to tribute summon them. This means that at least 1 monster has to be on the field to be tributed off for that monster that has that level of 5 or 6. And on the other hand, a monster with a level of 7 or 8 requires 2 tributes in order to summon that monster, meaning that at least 2 monsters have to be in your monster zones in order for you to tribute over them to tribute summon that big level monster. And anything with the level of 9 or higher will require 3 tributes to summon, and most of the time this is indicated on the card itself. For example, you have a card like Obelisk the Tormentor, one of the most famous cards in the game. He specifically states that he needs 3 monsters in order to tribute summon himself. But I figured I would still cover that anyways in case there's some big monster that you might find that may not have that wording in the card. Moving on from the monsters, we have the spells. Now in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are many different spells. There are quick play spells, normal spells, ritual spells, continuous spells, and field spells. Now, with all these different kinds of spells, they can all be activated this turn, and depending on the prerequisites of the card, it'll dictate whether or not you can activate it that turn. So, for example, with a card like Wanted Seeker of Sinful Spoils, this card can be activated at any time because it is a quick play spell. It can also be activated in a chain link, which I will get into later, and because the card has no prerequisite, that allows the player to activate it whenever they like. Now on the other hand, we have a card like Deception of the Sinful Spoils. This card requires a tribute from the hand or field in order to activate its effect, and it will always specifically indicate this when the sentence is cut off by a colon or semicolon, meaning that is its activation requirement. And I know I'm using a different type of spell here because Deception of the Sinful Spoils is a continuous spell. The only difference between that and a quick play spell is that a quick play spell can be activated in a chain link, as I stated earlier, but continuous spells, normal spells, and all the other that follow cannot be activated as quick effects in the hand and must be activated just in what we call an open game state. The big thing about quick play spells is that they can also be set and activated on your opponent's turn, because it is considered a quick effect. And with these spells, you must activate them in one of the 5 spell and trap zones that you have. Now don't get confused, because most players see that on the edges of the spell and trap zone, they see these little diamonds, and we call those the pendulum zones. But the pendulum zones are still considered spell and trap zones, so you can activate any spell or trap in that zone if you wish. But then this leads into the next mechanic of the game, which are trap cards. Trap cards get a little tricky, but I'll explain them to you. So with trap cards, they also have their variants. There are normal traps, counter traps, and continuous traps. So with normal traps, they can be activated at any point, but the key thing is that they must be set during your turn and can only be activated the turn after they are set. So for example, if you're going first and you have a card like Infinite Impermanence, you may set that card in your main phase 1, and when you end your turn, you can activate it whenever during your opponent's turn, so long as you meet the prerequisite requirements to activate that card, which in this case, it's target one face-up monster on the field in order to negate its effects. If you ever get confused about the complicated wording in Yu-Gi-Oh!, feel free to always reach out to me, and I can always coach you on how to understand the wording in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I will admit, Konami does make it a bit complicated to understand. But moving on, we now have counter traps. So here's the thing about counter traps. In Yu-Gi-Oh! We have what are called spell speeds, and it can go from spell speed 1, 2, and 3. With counter traps, they have the fastest spell speed, which is spell speed 3, meaning any card with a spell speed of 3 cannot be responded to unless it is being responded to with an equivalent spell speed. So for example, a card like Solemn Judgment is activated in order to negate some effect or summon. You can only respond to Solemn Judgment if you activate another card that has that counter trap symbol on it. Because in Yu-Gi-Oh! Counter traps are actually the fastest cards in the game and are actually the only cards in the game that can respond to themselves. So again, Solemn Judgment can only be responded to unless you have another Solemn Judgment or any other counter trap that can negate trap cards. I know that's when it gets a little bit hairy, but trust me, that is the key thing that you need to note about counter traps. And then finally, continuous traps. These are much like its other counterparts, where you need to set them and activate them on your turn. However, they function exactly the same as continuous spells, where when activated, they remain on the field until removed from the field. And this leads to the other part in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you must be aware of. When cards are removed from the field, they can either go to the graveyard or the banishment, as it's now called. The graveyard is simply just, as the name implies, where dead cards go. So, any card removed from the field goes straight into the graveyard unless stated otherwise in its card effect. A card like Cosmic Cyclone, for example, specifically banishes one spell on the field, which would then go into the banishment. And with that covered, this leads to the final mechanic of the game that you need to be aware of. And that are what I will call extra monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! So in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are many different monster card types. There are normal effect monsters, normal monsters, which are indicated usually by a yellow border. But then we have ritual monsters, synchro monsters, XYZ monsters, and link monsters. There is one of these monster cards that differentiates itself from the others, in that ritual monsters are actually monsters that go in your main deck. They actually do not go in your extra deck. So even though I'm explaining them with, as I called them, the extra monsters, this is the only one that actually does not go in your extra deck. And with ritual monsters, unless stated otherwise in its card effect, these monsters have to be summoned with a ritual spell card. So take, for example, we have Meteonis Drytron, the ritual spell for any Drytron monster, or even any ritual monster in general, as it states in its card. This is the kind of spell that you need to use in order to ritual summon a monster. And each ritual summon requires level requirements unless stated otherwise. So, for example, we have a card like Cyber Angel Ben 10. She requires a monster level of 6 in order to ritual summon her out onto your field. And this can be with either one single monster that has a level of 6 or multiple monsters that equal 6, but they cannot exceed 6. That is the key thing. When you're ritual summoning, you cannot exceed the level. And the same goes for when you are performing a synchro summon. Now with synchro summons, this is when it gets a little bit more complicated, but in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are monsters that possess a tuner mechanic, and this is always indicated in the monster card effect. So with a card like Incredible Ecclesia, for example, she specifically states that she has the tuner mechanic in her card effect, and with this, she can be used to synchro summon any monster as so long as she meets the requirement for that monster. So we could take a card like Visas Amritara, who requires one tuner and a light monster in order to synchro summon this card. Incredible Ecclesia fulfills one part of this requirement, which is being the tuner. And in order to summon Amritara, it functions similarly to a ritual summon. But for this, you must actually have 2 monsters in order to make this. Now in this example, this only specifically applies to Amritara, because there are many different synchro monsters that allow one or more non-tuner monsters in order to be used for its synchro summon, and the same goes for tuners, but this will always be indicated in the card's description. So, as I was saying, with Ecclesia fulfilling one requirement, being the tuner, we must now have a level 4 monster that is a light monster to complement Ecclesia in order to synchro summon. But in this example, that monster must be light and it must be a level 4, because again, we cannot exceed the levels in a synchro summon, much like a ritual summon. And now jumping from one of the more complicated summoning mechanics in the game to a much simpler mechanic, which is XYZ summoning. Now with this, the requirements to summon these guys are much simpler and are specifically stated in the card text. So for example, you have a card like Kashtira Arise Heart, who is banned by the way, who requires 3 level 7 monsters in order to XYZ summon himself. And what an XYZ summon is you take those 3 level 7 monsters on your field, put them all together, and you do what is called an overlay, which you summon out the XYZ monster on top of those other monsters. Because now those 3 level 7 monsters now become what is called material for that XYZ monster. And this material is more often than not required to activate some part of its XYZ effect, which will always be stated in the card. And the way that this happens is, again in this example we have Arise Heart, who requires 3 detachments in order to activate his effect. And so all that means is that you just take the 3 monsters underneath him, move them off to the graveyard unless stated otherwise, and you are now allowed to activate its effect. It sounds difficult, I know, but believe me, it is much simpler than synchro summoning in my opinion. But now we jump into the last summoning mechanic of the game, which is link summoning. And link summoning is probably the easiest form of summoning, where it simply states the requirements that it needs in order to be summoned out. So for example, we have IP Masquerena, which is 2 non-link monsters. And what that means is, if you have 2 monsters on the board that are not link monsters, you can summon her out by what is called linking those monsters away, which is simply just taking those 2 monsters, putting them in the graveyard unless stated otherwise, and then she goes in your extra monster zone specifically. Now that is the one catch about link summoning. If you are initiating a link summon, it always starts in the extra monster zone, and then from there, if you perform any additional link summons, they will have to connect to each other with the red arrows that are always highlighted in the card art. And with that, that is everything that you can do in the main phase 1. And now we jump on to the battle phase. However, the thing is, with the battle phase, this is actually completely skipped for the first player. Now I know what you're thinking. If I can't use the draw phase and I can't use the battle phase, why would I want to go first? But that will actually completely depend on your strategy. And again, if you need help determining that, you can always leave a comment down below or reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram, whatever you follow me on, and I'll get back to you on that. But again, the battle phase is completely skipped for the first player. And so for the player going second, in the battle phase, there is no summoning that can happen unless stated otherwise in a card's effect. And this is just basically where all the battle damage happens, where you take your big monsters and you're just swinging at each other until somebody gets to 0 life points. And speaking of life points, each player is always going to start with 8,000 life points. And once a player reaches 0 life points, the game is done. So, in the battle phase, there are some little quirky mechanics that you must note once conducting a battle. So, when a monster battles, its initial declaration of battle against another monster is what we call battle declaration. There are certain card effects that can be activated in this attack declaration. For example, we have a card like Kashtira Fenrir, who specifically states in his card effect that when he is declaring an attack, he can activate his effect to banish 1 face-up card on the field face down. And what this means is that if Fenrir is battling a monster and he banishes that monster face down, his attack will actually continue through directly against the other player. And that is simply just a mechanic of Yu-Gi-Oh! That you must be aware of. Because when moving forward, we have what is called the damage step and damage calculation. So, in the damage step, there are certain cards that cannot be activated in this part of the battle phase. And each player must be responsible for being aware of what part of the battle phase we are in. Again, if you are in the damage step and we take a card like Fenrir again, his effect can actually not be activated in the damage step because it specifically says, except the damage step. And the only other things that can be activated during this part of the battle phase are cards like quick play spells, trap cards, and other monsters that state otherwise in their effect. And the same goes for the next step of the battle phase, which is damage calculation. And as the name implies, it is simply just when any battle damage is calculated against the player receiving the battle damage. And with that, that basically concludes the battle phase. And that follows on to main phase 2. Main phase 2 is literally just main phase 1, but you get a second main phase. However, you will not have a main phase 2 unless you have conducted a battle phase and have ended successfully that battle phase. The The reason I say that is because cards like Runic quick play spells, for example, they specifically skip your battle phase. And this is crucial to note because that means that you cannot have a main phase 2 if your battle phase is skipped, because as I had stated earlier, you must have successfully conducted a battle phase in order to have a main phase 2. And that is really only the key thing about main phase 2. So again, that also means that if you are going first, you do not have a main phase 2. And I'm sure by this point you're like, whoa, why would I still want to go first? Again, depending on your deck, I can always break that down for you. But then moving on to the final phase of Yu-Gi-Oh! That is the end phase. And this is basically you ending your turn, and the end phase allows for any last effects that you may have to be activated during that turn unless stated otherwise in the card. So we take a card like the Unstoppable Exodia, for example. He has an effect in the end phase in order for you to set one Exod spell or trap from your deck. And there are many other cards like this that can activate in the end phase. There are many effects in the game that last until the end phase. So that is also a crucial thing to keep note of, and is also something I can break down for you further in either another video or when you reach out to me directly. Some things I want to note is that I have a full breakdown of staples that you can use in your decks in order to better your strategy and be a little bit more successful if you want to compete competitively or if you just want a better chance against your friends. Speaking of which, you're probably wondering, what decks would I want to play in Yu-Gi-Oh? There's so many cards and so many cool looking monsters that I'm so interested in that I don't know what I should be spending my money on. Well, here's the thing. If you want my honest advice, in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you are going to be playing at a more casual level, it really is in your best interest that you invest in what we call legacy decks. Legacy decks are decks in Yu-Gi-Oh that all the boomers know. So, like Blue Eyes White Dragon, Dark Magician, all those iconic monster cards in Yu-Gi-Oh, those are considered legacy decks. And the reason why I say those are the best investments you can make in Yu-Gi-Oh is because those decks are always going to receive support, and they more often than not do not possess a heavy meta presence, meaning that they're never warranted to be hit on the ban list. But if you want to have a more competitive experience, then you can invest a little bit more money into a deck, but you won't have to step too far, because there are actually a lot of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh that have been reprinted heavily this year, as I was mentioning earlier. So with boxes like Rarity Collections 1 and 2, the Megatins that have come out over the years, and with Bonanza, all the staple cards that you could use in a deck are now fully available to all players, including new players, and completely budget options. And if you want more budget options, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, and I will actually make a full video breaking down some budget decks that you could make right now. So I know that may be a lot to absorb with all these different phases in the game, all these different effects in Yu-Gi-Oh that you have to be aware of, and all the different decks that you could be making. But again, there are so many resources out there and so many good people like myself that you can always reach out to and seek for help, because as I had stated earlier, this is the best time to get into Yu-Gi-Oh with so many things being accessible now. And if you really enjoyed this video, please always like and share and subscribe, and be sure to check out our website where we sell all these different Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and we have our business email there if you want to reach out for more help. So thank you so much for watching, and take care.